Sometimes it seems like everyone has a dog, and for good reason. Dogs are incredibly intelligent and trainable animals, and have lived alongside humans for tens of thousands of years, earning the nickname man's best friend. However, you might want something different from a dog. There was an animal that lived around 260 million years ago and looked like a deranged dog from hell. Gorgonops, a predator that branched off so early in the mammalian evolutionary tree that the differences between mammal and reptile were far less defined. Could you keep this animal as a replacement for a dog? Before we get into the animal care, we need to know what a Gorgonops is. It was a type of therapsid that lived during the late Permian period 260 to 254 million years ago. Therapsids, by the way, were just an extinct group of later, more derived synapsids, which includes animals like Dimetrodon, but appeared much more mammal-like. The genus Gorgonops contains 3 confirmed species, G. torvis, G. waitsi, and G. longifrons, all of which were discovered in the Karoo Basin of South Africa. These species do have minor differences, mainly in size, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be focusing on the type species Gorgonops torvis. Best known from mostly incomplete skulls, Gorgonops wasn't a very well understood animal until an almost complete semi-articulated postcranial skeleton was discovered, and in 2023, Eva Maria Bendel, Christian F. Kammerer, Roger M. H. Smith, and George Frobisch, I am butchering that pronunciation, described this specimen of Gorgonops torvis. Based on this material, Gorgonops is estimated to have likely had a full length ranging from about 4 to 6 feet, or 1.2 to 1.8 meters long, so comparable to a big dog. A really big dog in some cases. Gorgonops was an apex predator of its time, and its anatomy allowed it to target larger prey, including massive reptiles like Pariasaurus and Bradysaurus, which, by the way, were both a lot heavier than you. And Gorgonops would have used its most striking feature to deal with these thick-skinned animals: 4.7-inch or 12-centimeter long canines that resembled that of the much later saber-toothed cats. Like a pair of built-in daggers, Gorgonops would have used these weapons to slash and stab its victim, targeting vulnerable areas. It has been hypothesized that Gorgonopsians across the board used a bite-and-retreat killing method, where they would ambush their prey, delivering a debilitating bite, inflicting massive blood loss and shock, before following its wounded prey and waiting until the animal was weak enough. Then the Gorgonopsian would overpower it, bite down on the neck with its massive canines, piercing major arteries and possibly the windpipe. It's not a very quick way to go. Before we can make any sort of comparison to a dog, we need to dive into whether or not it can be kept indoors in the first place. Like I said, Gorgonops ranged in size from 4 to 6 feet, or 1.2 to 1.8 meters long, and its semi-upright posture and rather short legs means it wasn't very tall. Given the fact Gorgonops was an animal from South Africa, does this mean you will have to keep your home very warm? Not exactly. During the reign of Gorgonops, Africa and all the other continents were joined together, forming the supercontinent Pangaea. South Africa was much farther south than it was today, which during the late Permian was a good thing. During the time of Gorgonops, the Earth was unbearably hotter than it is today. Massive volcanic activity was releasing huge amounts of CO2, which acted as a greenhouse gas, trapping the heat in the Earth's atmosphere. In the hottest parts of Pangaea, temperatures may have reached 70 degrees Celsius at times. However, down in the Karoo Basin, it was slightly cooler, with dramatic wet and dry seasons. Summer highs may have reached 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. However, a 20 to 30 degrees Celsius estimated yearly average means that room temperature should be fine for your Gorgonops. Basically, if you are keeping your Gorgonops indoors, you don't need to worry about the heating bill. Lastly, if you do decide to keep your Gorgonops indoors, how much havoc will this demon dog wreak in your home? Well, to gauge that, we need to look at Gorgonops' intelligence. In general, Gorgonopsians had brains that strongly resembled that of reptiles, lacking a neocortex like mammals, which is needed for complex behaviours such as sensory perception, reasoning, and memory, among other things. However, they did possess a large hindbrain, which is responsible for vital bodily functions as well as coordinating movement and balance, which is useful when launching ambush attacks on prey twice your size. Gorgonopsians also had a heightened sense of smell and excellent binocular vision. While not comparable to a dog in intelligence, Gorgonops would have been more intelligent than most reptiles, possibly even monitor lizards, which possess a more developed brain than other reptiles, allowing for more complex behaviours, including the ability to learn, solve problems, respond to their name, and even things like returning to their enclosure on command. They can also learn different cues to indicate when it is feeding time or time for interaction, and some monitors seem to view attention as a reward. However, whether they actually do or not is subject to scientific debate. This is important because if we were to assume that Gorgonops was as intelligent as monitor lizards, then we are dealing with an animal that was likely pretty trainable. It won't sit when told or fetch a stick, but over time it can learn commands, and if raised correctly, your Gorgonops will not view you as a threat or food, so long as you don't starve it. Essentially, Gorgonops should at least be able to get to the point of realizing that its survival depends on you. And like monitor lizards, you should be able to form a strong bond with this animal. However, this isn't a bond built on affection. It's a bond based on trust. Monitor lizards seem to sometimes seek attention, but will your Gorgonops do the same? Will it ever come and sit with you on the couch? Well, for that answer, I'm going to briefly dive into Gorgonops as a social animal in the wild, and it'll also tell you whether or not you can keep more than one. So the short answer is that keeping more than one is a horrible idea. Unlike dogs, which descended from wolves, and as we know, wolves live in packs in the wild, Gorgonops was more than likely a solitary hunter, and a fossilized Gorgonops skull with healed bite marks inflicted by a member of the same species indicates that violent intraspecific altercations occurred, and that Gorgonops was likely a very territorial animal. However, the same can be said for reptiles as a whole, but this doesn't stop us forcing our want of attention onto them. Even green iguanas can be tamed down, which are less intelligent than Gorgonops and highly territorial animals, but can get to the point of seemingly enjoying attention, like monitor lizards. However, green iguanas are known to usually only tolerate either one person, their owner, or with a lot of training and socialization, a select few people. While I would love to say that Gorgonops would be as friendly as a dog, I would be lying if I did. In fact, the polar opposite is likely the case. Dogs are also territorial. However, with a lot of exposure and socialization at a young age, strangers are not viewed as threats. Often, instead, a positive thing. Without proper socialization at a young age, a dog can become a living hell. I doubt that Gorgonops would be as easy to tame down, especially given the fact that they most likely lived out their lives in solitude. With proper hands-on socialization with other people, your Gorgonops may tolerate visitors. However, without it, the moment a stranger walks through your front door, your naturally territorial Gorgonops would turn from a slump on the couch to the villain of a slasher movie. And do not get more than one Gorgonops, otherwise your house will become a bloodbath. Hope is not lost, however. You don't have to keep Gorgonops in your home. Instead, your Gorgonops will do just fine in an outdoor enclosure, depending on where you live. So how big would this enclosure need to be? Well, as usual, we're going to use our formula for coming up with a minimum size recommendation for a Gorgonops. But due to the fact Gorgonops was an active, warm-blooded predator, we are going to increase it slightly. Our usual formula is the length of the animal in feet squared times 10. But in the case of Gorgonops, we're going to double the space by multiplying it by 20. I'm going to use the larger estimate for the length of Gorgonops at 6 feet, or 1.8 meters, which brings the enclosure area to 720 square feet, or 66.9 square meters. But as usual, the bigger you can make this enclosure, the better. This is just a minimum recommendation. Now, as for keeping the animal contained, you're going to need 107 feet or 32.6 meters of fencing for a 720 square feet or 66.9 square meter enclosure. And as for height, Gorgonops probably couldn't climb very well, and nor could it jump very high, so you don't really need to have the fence soaring to the sky. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. I would estimate that the length of the animal, plus an extra foot, should suffice for height. So for a 6 feet 1.8 meter long Gorgonops, a 7 feet or 2.1 meter tall fence should do. Now what should this fence be made of, I hear you ask? Well, let's look at the anatomy of a Gorgonops. Contrary to what you might assume, Gorgonops likely had a relatively weak bite force for its size. Its jaws were adapted to assume an extremely wide gape at almost 90 degrees. This wide gape comes at a cost, as the muscles used for closing the jaw need to be longer, and longer muscles generate less force. The hinge of the jaw is also adapted for rotation, not crushing. One characteristic feature of Gorgonops is a reduced coronoid process, which basically means that the coronoid process, which is the bony protrusion of the lower jaw where the jaw closing muscles attach, was low. A lower coronoid process in an animal points towards a weaker bite force, as the muscles have less area to attach to, meaning they have less leverage. These drawbacks are all thanks to one thing, the saber teeth. Similar to Gorgonops, saber-toothed cats also had a weaker bite force for their size, because both of them didn't need a crushing bite. Their canines were knives, not hammers. If Gorgonops had a strong bite force, its canines would almost certainly snap off when gnawing struggling prey. And in order to drive in those long canines, you need a wide gape. So Gorgonops isn't going to be attacking any fences by biting them, but it's still not a good idea to use any wired fencing just in case. One thing we do have to keep in mind is the weight of the animal. Based on the aforementioned study of the nearly complete G. torvis skeleton, the animal was estimated to have weighed up to 98 kilograms. Roughly the weight of a Komodo dragon. And the fence you choose to house them needs to compensate for this. I would avoid wood at all costs. Not because it wouldn't keep a Gorgonops contained, but because eventually it will get damp, rot, and begin to fall apart. Many intelligent predatory animals that are kept in captivity are known to test the boundaries of their enclosure for weakness or escape opportunities. And when you're dealing with a predator that has enough determination to wound prey, then stalk them for hours or even days, you can be sure that this animal, while not massively intelligent, will not get bored of assessing its fence. If it ever chose to push or ram 98 kilograms of weight into an old wooden fence, that wooden fence wouldn't hold up for long. Instead, you are going to need to opt for something a little stronger. One simple and long-lasting solution would be to build the fence using prefabricated steel fencing panels. I found a company called Rhino Steel Cladding that makes vertical steel fence panels that can last up to 30 years. Each panel is 6 feet or 1.8 meters wide and comes in a variety of heights and colours. However, the maximum height listed on their website is 6 feet or 1.8 meters. But remember, we require a 7 feet or 2.1 meter fence height. They did state on their website that other sizes are available upon request. So how many of these 6 feet or 1.8 meter wide panels would you need to get the closest match to the minimum recommended space for a Gorgonops? Well, since I mentioned before that we need 107 feet or 32.6 meters of fence to surround the enclosure, then simply dividing 107 by 6 would give us 18 fence panels. These 18 fence panels will be 7 feet or 2.1 meters tall. Like I said, I can't say how much it'll cost for the 7 feet or 2.1 meter tall fence, but the 6 feet or 1.8 meter tall panel is exactly £10 more expensive than the 5 feet or 1.5 meter tall panel, at £87.50. Using this logic, I'm going to assume that the 7 feet tall fence would cost £97.50 per panel, costing a total of £1,755 for 18 of them. Now you will need something to hold these panels up and together. Luckily for you, Rhino Steel Cladding also offers 8 feet long concrete posts with slots to match the steel panels. Simply buy the same amount of posts that you have panels. This will cost you £324 for 18 posts, bringing the total for the enclosure to £2,079. It's also good to keep in mind that Gorgonops would be used to a 20 to 30 degrees Celsius as a yearly average. So many countries are already out of the question. For example, the average yearly temperature where I live is about 8 to 9 degrees Celsius. So I can't keep a Gorgonops outside, and I'm not keeping one in the house. So I don't really know why I'm still making this video. Alas, I shall continue. So we've sussed out the enclosure, its size and what it's made from, and how much it'll cost. But before I dive into the actual care of the animal itself, I am going to quickly dive into decorations. Obviously, to make sure your Gorgonops is sufficiently enriched, you are going to want to try and recreate the animal's natural environment to the best of your ability. So back in the late Permian, what is now South Africa would have been a pretty dry place for the most part, and vegetation would have existed in sparse pockets. So to try and replicate this, you're going to want to use a dry, desert-like ground. Maybe not sand, but just hard dirt. Then, in one of the corners of the enclosure, have plants that would have been contemporary for Gorgonops, such as Glossopteris and ferns. This will also provide Gorgonops with some places to hide. You will also need to think about a source of water for Gorgonops, so provide a small water trough in the enclosure, and remember to clean it out regularly. Finally, we are on to the subject of feeding your Gorgonops, and how much this will cost you. I briefly mentioned before that Gorgonops was a warm-blooded animal, which is true, but not to the extent of a true mammal. Think of their metabolism as being somewhere between a mammal and a reptile. This means that it didn't need to eat as often as a mammal. However, it did need to eat more than a reptile. A Komodo dragon, for example, can eat up to 80% of its own body weight in a single meal. then go several weeks before needing to eat again. Something like a lion, on the other hand, needs to eat up to 20 to 35% of its own body weight per week. However, similar to the Komodo dragon, a lion can eat a large meal, then go 3 to 4 days before needing to eat again. So in the case of Gorgonops, we're going to be somewhere in the middle, able to store energy for longer thanks to its slightly lower metabolism, but requiring food more often than a reptile. And we do have to keep in mind that Gorgonops is targeting large prey, so it more than likely would have eaten a large portion in one go, before needing to eat again. So let's guess that a Gorgonops would need to eat up to 30% of its own body weight per week. About the same as a lion, but not as often. This means that a 98 kilogram fully grown Gorgonops would need to eat up to 30 kilograms per week. So how much is that 30 kilograms of meat per week going to cost you? Well, it's difficult to say, especially since it does depend on where you live and what kind of meat you're feeding the animal. Prehistoric meat would be preferable, since this is what Gorgonops was used to. But for example, let's go with a fully butchered cow, which you can freeze and simply feed 30 kilograms per week to your Gorgonops. jhfarms.co.uk sells a whole cow weighing upwards of 250 kilograms for £550. If you were to buy one of these and freeze it, it will last you up to 8 weeks. £550 every 2 months is not bad. That is going to cost £3,300 per year. Not cheap, but compared to other prehistoric animals I have covered, it's not that expensive. Gorgonops as a whole really isn't that bad to keep as a pet when it comes to the cost of keeping one. However, would Gorgonops make a good pet? Well, kind of, but only for the right person. And it most certainly is not a replacement for a dog. We're done. Thanks for watching. And if you have any requests for any other videos, comment them down below. Oh, also, I'm gonna be trying to get videos up more regularly. You have to keep in mind that I do work full time. So to help me on that journey away from having to work full time, I do have a members page on here, which you can access more premium features, such as weekly live streams on Blender, where I model low poly dinosaurs, as you've seen in other videos, and Patreon only videos. We do travel quite regularly. Yeah, there's a vlog on there from our Italy trip where we went to a lot of museums and stuff and saw a lot of cool dinosaur skeletons. So, want to support me? Think about becoming a member, because it's good fun. And the live streams are fun as well. So, see you there. 32.6 meters of fencing for a 720 square feet or a 66.9 square meter enclosure. 32.6 meters of fencing for a 720 square feet or 32.6 meters of fencing for a 720 square feet or 66.9 meter enclosure. 66.9 square meter enclosure. You. Oh my god. For a 720 square feet or 66.9 square you're going to need 107. Now, as for keeping the animal contained, you're going to need 107 feet.